The dusk train moaned as it ground to a halt, its iron wheels sighing against the rails. The sky above was painted in bruised shades of crimson and gold, as though heaven itself bore witness to the ache of travelers who had ridden too far with too little left in them. Among the women who stepped down, each claimed quickly by a waiting man, stood one figure apart. Clara Mayfield. Her dress, once pale blue, had faded into something ghostly, its hem worn by miles of travel and hands tugging against fabric too fine for the dust of the West. She clutched her gloves as if they alone kept her from shaking apart, a folded letterpress thin against her palm. Around her, laughter swelled, embraces found their place, tears turned to smiles. Yet Clara's eyes searched the crowd for a face that never came. Whispers rose instead, low, sharp-edged, the kind that pricked deeper than shouts. A woman without a claim. A mistake set loose from a train. By the time her boots found the road leading out of town, the shadows had grown long and thin. She carried the letter like a lantern through the gathering dark, following the directions that promised a husband, a home, a new life. At the gate of the Hollister Ranch, she paused, heart battering itself against her ribs. The man who answered, Jonas Hollister, stood broad-shouldered, weathered, his hat tipped low as though the setting sun was something to guard against. His eyes, gray and restless, met hers with confusion. Her voice faltered as she introduced herself, reading his name from the letter. Jonas shifted, discomfort written in every line of him. He explained, carefully, that the letter she held bore not his hand but his cousin's. She had been sent to the wrong ranch. The words fell like a stone in a well, echoing into the hollow places of her heart. Shame wrapped around her shoulders, heavier than the satchel she carried. Jonas's tone was not cruel. If anything, there was a shadow of pity, but pity could wound more sharply than scorn. He offered her a meal before she continued on, but his voice carried no promise beyond that. She would have turned to leave then, gathering what pride she could, but a soft sound pulled her still. From behind the barn, a little girl stepped into view. Lydia Hollister, 7 years old, with braids undone and eyes too wide for her small face. She looked at Clara not with suspicion, but with a kind of fragile hope, the kind only a child could carry. Her words, barely above a whisper, trembled like a secret carried too long. God finally sent you to us. Jonas stiffened, turning away as though the moment had no place in the air between them. Yet Clara felt something loosen within her chest. She knelt, meeting the child's eyes at level, dust swirling gently around them as the sun dipped low. Lydia reached for Clara's hand as though it had already belonged to her. That night, Jonas relented to let her stay. A storm was brewing and the road would be treacherous after dark. Supper was late and quiet, the table long, and the air filled with the crackle of fire more than words. Jonas ate with steady patience, Lydia peeking at Clara between spoonfuls. Clara, hungry but cautious, offered a piece of her bread to the girl without fanfare, her smile tentative. Jonas noticed, though he did not speak. There was something in the way Clara's movements held grace, as though she were determined to be gentle in a world that had not offered her gentleness. The following morning, Clara's steps carried her into town. She hoped for supplies, perhaps even kindness, but what greeted her instead was the sting of whispers sharpened into open words. She was sent to the wrong man. Unwanted already. A woman in lace gloves turned away with a smirk. Men on the porch exchanged knowing glances, and even the sheriff muttered that she ought to move along. Clara lowered her gaze, heat burning in her cheeks, her hands trembling as she gathered the small things she could afford. Across the street, Jonas watched, jaw tight, yet his silence felt like abandonment. The cruelty of strangers was one thing, but silence from the only man who knew her truth, that wound bled deeper. Later, as Jonas hitched his horse to ride her toward the cousin she was promised, Lydia's voice rose, pleading, "Just one more night." Her eyes brimmed with a sorrow that broke something in him. And so Clara stayed. That evening, she helped Lydia with chores, her hands steady as they washed little clothes, and her voice soft as she braided the girl's hair. By lamplight, she told her a story, one her own mother had whispered to her long ago. The child leaned against her, trusting, resting. From the doorway Jonas stood, his shadow stretched across the floor, watching without stepping closer. When the house grew quiet and Clara lay in a borrowed bed, she stared at the silver wash of moonlight across the floorboards. Her hands folded, her lips moved in prayer. Not a plea for a husband, not for a life of riches, just a quiet, breaking whisper. Lord, don't let me be cast aside again. And the night carried that prayer into the silence, holding it like an ember waiting for breath. Morning broke with a storm rolling heavy across the valley, the kind that turned roads into rivers and made mountains vanish behind a gray curtain of rain. Clara stood by the window of the Hollister Ranch house, her breath fogging the glass, watching water carve channels through the dirt yard. Whatever chance she had of leaving was swallowed whole by the storm, and so she remained, caught in a place that was not hers but felt, in secret corners of her heart, like it might be. Days passed under the hammering rain, the house filled with the rhythm of ordinary life, the kind Clara had longed for without daring to name it. She and Lydia moved together as though they had always known one another, sewing patches into shirts, reading scraps of old books, giggling over Lydia's clumsy braids. Jonas kept to himself, shoulders hunched against ghosts he did not name, but Clara caught him watching when she mended his worn coat, her fingers threading patience into every stitch. The fire hissed and cracked, lanterns flickered against rain-blurred windows, and the air between them thickened, not with words, but with what was left unsaid. When the storm eased enough for town business, Clara went with Jonas to fetch supplies. The whispers had not softened. They rose like nettles in the dusty street, sharper than before. One woman sneered openly, her voice cutting through the market. You'll never be more than someone else's mistake. Clara's face flamed, shame pressing her down, but before she could turn away, Jonas's voice broke across the murmurs. Steady, firm. She's under my roof. My word stands. The crowd fell silent, not out of kindness, but because Jonas Hollister's word carried weight. Clara could not look at him as they walked away, tears threatening, not from the cruelty she had heard, but for the quiet defense she had never expected. The days stretched, marked by small acts that seemed ordinary but carried weight enough to anchor the soul. Clara left biscuits on the table after Jonas's long rides. She sat with Lydia by lantern light, guiding her finger across letters until words bloomed. Jonas began repairing Clara's battered trunk without speaking of it, his rough hands sanding and mending with the care of a man who gave more through action than speech. Their hands brushed at the supper table, their eyes lingered in moments unguarded, and though neither spoke of love, the silence grew warm with it. Still, shame clung to Clara. Was she not still a burden, misplaced, unwanted? One evening, a letter arrived by Ryder. Jonas broke its seal, his brow shadowing as his eyes ran across the words. It was from his cousin, the man who was meant to marry Clara. Cold words, cruel in their bluntness. She was no longer desired, no longer welcome. Her misstep a stain too deep to scrub clean. Clara's face crumpled as Jonas read, though he said nothing aloud. She excused herself, heart collapsing inward. Alone, she wept into her hands, certain that even fate itself had turned her away. Jonas stared at the letter until the firelight blurred it, then fed it into the flames, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained. He spoke no comfort, but his silence carried a fierce vow. She would not be discarded again. The turning came on a night when Lydia fell ill. Fever gripped her small body, cheeks flushed, her breath shallow and quick. Panic seized Jonas, pulling him back into the helplessness of years before, when sickness had taken his wife no matter how hard he fought. His hands shook, his voice stumbled, and he stood as though braced against a storm within his chest. Clara, however, moved with calm urgency. She brewed cool cloths, coaxed Lydia to sip water, hummed low lullabies into the night. She did not falter, not once, even as hours dragged and the child's skin burned beneath her hand. Jonas stood in the doorway, shadows carved deep in his face, watching as Clara's strength lit the room with something beyond courage, something that looked like love. Through the long night she never left Lydia's side, her back bowed in patience, her fingers smoothing the child's damp hair. At dawn, when light finally crept through the window, Lydia stirred and whispered with a hoarse but certain voice, "I told you. God sent you to us." Jonas could not remain in the doorway any longer. He crossed the room and sank to his knees beside them, his hand trembling as it found Clara's. His voice never spoke the words, but the weight of his touch carried them all the same. His silence, once a wound, became a vow. Clara felt it. She was no longer misplaced, no longer a mistake. She was chosen, not by contract, not by accident, but by grace. The storm broke that morning, the valley gleaming fresh beneath the rising sun. The house filled with sounds of laughter again, not forced but true, as though life itself had returned to the Hollister ranch. The town still whispered, but their voices no longer carried weight. What mattered was the warmth at the supper table, the laughter of a child in her arms, the steady presence of a man who had opened his heart without saying a word. And if you listen close, as the wind carries stories across the wide plains, you may still hear the lesson of Clara Mayfield. Sometimes the roads we take lead us astray, yet it is on those wrong paths that we are delivered where we are most needed. Love does not arrive on schedule, nor by letters sealed with wax, but in the quiet strength of holding on, in the way a child leans against you, in the way a man chooses to stay. Remember this, dear heart, sometimes the wrong road carries you home.